Okay, now when we die, ceasing, taking us to death, when we die, the mental consciousness leaves the body. So death means, oh, I forgot to switch off, never mind. Death means the mental consciousness leaves the body. So what is the I now? There's no body. It's merely labeled on the basis of what the mental consciousness does, right? So all we're left with is the mental consciousness. So now we label, I'm dying. Now, I don't think we have that thought in that moment, right? But I can do it now. I can do now and label, the moment I die, my mental consciousness will leave my body. So I can even label now. We're not restricted to time. You remember, to be the first Dalai Lama, you don't have to be called that while you're the first Dalai Lama. Conventionally, we would still all agree that the first Dalai Lama was the first Dalai Lama. He's referred to conventionally as the first Dalai Lama, and that's correct. Similarly, even if in that moment, while my mental consciousness is leaving my body, sorry, I forgot to switch off my phone. That was someone else, but it's actually me. It keeps doing that. So actually, while we're, just need to, sorry, just a sec. So while we're dying, there may not be the thought, very unlikely to the thought I, because actually the mind is quite subtle. Even if in the sutric system it's not explained that way, but it's really subtle. So there won't be that thought. It's very unlikely to have the thought, I'm dying, or I'm dead now. But still, early on or later on, or even if I were hypothetically to label, it would be correct. So the I is labeled on the basis of the mental consciousness. So we say there's no body on which the I is labeled in that moment. There's no sense consciousness on the basis of which we can label I, because there are no sense consciousness in that moment. However, there is a merely labeled I. So you just need to ask, what is the basis on which you label mental consciousness? What is the basis on which you label, I see the sun? What is the basis for labeling I? When you say, I see the sun? I consciousness, very good. I hear techno music. Which I consciousness, which I heard about your meditation. It's nice to be able to laugh at that. Have a good laugh, that's good. Okay, so what is the base of invitation when you say I hear techno music? Ear consciousness, you see? On the basis of your ear consciousness hearing music, you label, I hear music. Is that a valid basis of labeling? Valid basis? Yes, it is. If I hear techno music and I say, Beate hears techno music, is that a valid basis? No. Because I'm focusing on my own I consciousness. I'm not called Beate. I don't refer to myself as Beate. I don't even use my name. I refer to myself as I. Therefore, it's not a valid basis. It would be wrong. It's not Beate who's listening to the techno music or hearing the techno music. She may be hearing it, but the point being here, I'm thinking of myself. So the basis is a mind or body part, etc. So on the basis of a function or on a situation or on seeing something, like I see myself. Seeing my arm. On the basis of the arm, I label, I see my arm. And an activity is always involved. And you're right to say there's, in terms of activity, an activity is usually involved, at least a perception and a labeling process. But what I'm specifically labeling on the movement, when I say I move, then it's an activity that consists of many different moments, right? None of those moments is the movements. Right? If you would take these individual moments, they're not movement. But taking all of them together, occurring in a certain sequence, with a certain speed, then I can label moving. Right? So I label movement. And since that which performs the movement It's a part of me I label my hand is moving or I am moving. Okay? Does that make sense? It's not that hard. I mean, it is hard, of course, but it's hard to then be satisfied with just that as the I. That's the I. No more is needed. More would be impossible. That's the mere I. In all cases, it's the merely labeled I, independence on a conceptual mind and a valid basis of designation. In short, mere I. Right? Does that make sense? So I hope, Beate, is your question answered? Yeah. Yes? Good? Satisfied? What is the relation? Now I'm asking you. Now I'm checking. So now, what is the relation between the I and the mind, for instance, at the time of death? What would you think? How do they relate? Does the I exist at the time of death?
No.
The I doesn't exist? You don't exist at the time of death? Is there no I? Not the way you exist right now. That's not my question. You see, this is something we're so trained in debate. Not what I think the other person asks, but what they actually ask. It's a bit of training, right? So when I say, at the time of your death, do you exist? I didn't ask, do you exist in the same way as you exist now? And of course, then the answer would be no. No, but at the time of your death, do you exist? Is there an I?
Yes.
Yes. What is that I? Is it a mere I? A merely labeled I? Based on what? What is the basis of designation of labeling I in that moment? While you're dying.
I'm dying, so...
Yeah, but what is the basis of designation? Which part of your mind and body is the basis of designation?
The mind?
Yes, the mental consciousness. That which moves on. That's it. See? Does that make sense?
So I'm a different type.
Pardon?
At the time of death,
Yes.
I'm a different type. Because a lot of the things that were there earlier
Yes.
are not valid anymore because
That's
I'm
true.
dying.
That's true. That's true. So your memory is pretty much gone. Memory gone. So the thing is, we often associate our sense of identity with our memories. That's why I said early on, that's why I gave this whole drawing. I means different things at different times to us, right? When we're at the moment of death, when our memories have dissolved, although they don't dissolve completely, not necessarily. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a memory of a previous life when you're very little. Some children still have memory, and you later on don't remember you had memories. And if you come from a culture as I did, it's not encouraged. Or it's not that anyone checks upon it and says, oh, she must have remember her past life. They think I'm just fantasizing. Yeah? And so, but not all the memory necessarily goes, which is quite interesting. We don't know how much. We don't know how many children really remember. Many may remember, but only as long as they don't have language yet to communicate it. And when they have the language to communicate it, they've forgotten and they never talk about it. It's possible that quite a bit of memory goes over. It's possible. So there's still a sense of identity also based on the memory to a certain degree. But even, let's say, all the memory is gone, our mind's ability to label I is still there. And I give you an example of a very interesting documentary I once saw. It's just a short clip, actually. It was a YouTube clip that's probably part of a longer documentary. It was about this neuroscientist who had great interest in understanding mind versus brain. And he had researched that, and he was the kind of person, well, being a neuroscientist, his tendency was to believe mind can't exist without brain, that it's the brain and mind is merely a byproduct, and so forth. And this man, he contracted meningitis, very dangerous disease, as you probably, as you probably know. And in his case, it was so severe that he fell into a coma. Or maybe his coma was induced, I don't know, whatever. But he was in a coma. And there was very little brain activity detected. And they were pretty concerned. Anyway, he awoke from that coma. He awakened from that coma and talked about it. And he said, mind can exist without brain. I have first-hand experience of that. He said he had these experiences, some kind of very disturbing experience, in fact, like a hellish experience. So when he talked, they just showed these weird patterns. I don't even know whether that was a reflection of what he perceived. But what he said was, he lost his ability for language. He had no words to access, but he could still think. He could still think. And there was a sense, this is happening to me. That was there, but without any ability to think. And it was there, and he had all these experiences. Although no words to use when we're thinking, we can use words. If you've learned language, you can use words, but he had lost that ability. And he had these experiences, and when he got back, it was so vivid. And he was told there was hardly any brain activity, and it's like, oh, it was so active. It was so active. No, the mind was totally there. There was no time when it was like gone. I mean, it was so vivid that he said, that was my brain and it wasn't really active, forget about the brain. Right? It was a scary experience. But besides that, the point that there was still a sense of self. He could talk about it, he could remember it. He had memory of that. He had memory of that because it registered in his mind. And there must have been a mental consciousness thinking, I. But he didn't have the word, of course. So labeling took place. Right? There was a sense, this is happening to me. But not in the pronounced way, like I am like this and I'm usually successful and how could this... Those thoughts couldn't arise because the whole sense of identity was not there in that moment. Usually, when we think I, it's not that simple. I'm thinking I can usually deal with problems. What's going on? You know, when I have a problem, am I going to manage that? I did last time. A whole sense of identity comes in. It's not just I. There's a lot more to it. There's a whole thought process of who we think we are that makes me. But even without all that, they talk about people, and there's a condition that not a lot of people have, but some people have. They have short-term memory. They don't have long-term memory. Their short-term memory is so short that they forget from day to day who they are, where they live, and so forth. So they need to be reminded all the time. And when a person was interviewed who had this disease, they said, we don't have a strong sense of identity. Of course not, because all your memories are gone. But did they have a sense of identity? Yes, they could distinguish between I and them. Definitely, when they talked. But it wasn't that fully developed sense of identity, which we didn't have when we were born, which we didn't have as children. Puberty, we had to go through all that to get a stronger sense of who we were. I had a strong sense of I and my sister. Oh, yeah, right. This is me more important than this weird person who came later, right? I had a very strong sense of that. But, I mean, weird, you know. I mean, anyway, you know what I mean. So anyway, I had a strong sense of I. But anything beyond that, no. I mean, the thoughts I had of myself as I went through puberty, confusion and everything. And then later on, of course, as I moved past that, very different. And as I continue in life, very different. It keeps changing.
What's the name of the YouTube? The YouTube?
I just Googled mind versus brain or something. Maybe even reincarnation. I don't know what I Googled. You know, it was like, oh, there's so much out there. And I don't want to look in the library. I'm just going to check. And there's so much. There's so much online. It's really interesting. So I don't remember. It was quite a while ago. Yes, please.
I'm wondering about the relation between activity, memory, and imprints.
Okay. Activity, memory, and imprints. Very good. Okay. use the word it's labeled. I'll keep using more the word it's labeled as this, it's labeled as that. And that way it becomes a little clearer that these terms are only given on the basis of certain situations. Okay, memory, imprints, and activity. All right, so let's take a certain scenario. This morning, I had coffee for breakfast. Okay, I had coffee for breakfast. So, I remember now. Remembering is an activity. Why do I call it activity? Because it's a process, a mental process. There's the intention to remember. That gives rise to the appearance of my coffee. It's in fact appearing right there. It makes my mouth water. So, the appearance of this object. And then I'm also almost reflecting on it. You know, a little bit like, oh, it was like this, it was like that. So it appears a little clearer as I'm thinking of it. So it's a whole process, it's an activity. On the basis of these different picture frames arising, I label activity. And since that activity is an experiencing activity, I label mind experiencing, memory. So you see where the labels come from? From these different appearances to my mind. I label activity. Because these appearances lay in the past, on that which experiences, I label memory. And what enabled me to have the memory in the first place is some residue that was left this morning on my mind. And again, I label that residue because now I'm able to remember. So because I had this mind this morning and I'm able to recall that, I label imprint. I label residue left on the mind because I have to make a connection between this morning and today. Being able to bring back that image. On the basis of the ability that I can do that now, upon you asking me a question, I label imprint. So you've got all three. Activity, excuse me, Luca, just one sec. You've got activity, you've got memory, you've got imprint. But since I'm labeling merely, since I keep using merely labeled, I don't want you to get a sense it's some natural imprint, some tiny little dot somewhere in my mind that's got this inherent. No. Something I merely label on the basis of the fact that I can do this. I have this ability. And since that ability comes from that time, I label, I left an imprint. I left some residue, which enables me to do that. Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
So on all
Just a sec, look.
imprints, so if I do like 100 activities, are there going to be 100 imprints?
You're thinking like there must be something for every one of them. You could label 100, yes. You could label 100 on the basis of 100 activities. But if these have only certain results, on the basis of 3 results, you could also label 3 imprints, whichever way you want it. It's in relation to these 100 activities, you could, because of some residues there, it always makes a difference. 100 activities or 99. So on the basis of these 100, you could say label 100 different imprints. That works. But from the point of view of what they rise to, if these 100 activities, let's say hypothetically, they only have 3 results, I could also label 3 labels. That would also be correct, right? When we say, let me just add one more example before Luca, of course, you get a chance to talk. So one more example. You know, we have this interesting way in which we love to use the word energy and potential. Why? Because it's not as clear cut. So when I say, what is the difference between an apple seed and a pear seed? Even if they look the same. We say one has the potential to give rise to an apple tree and one to a pear seed, a pear tree. And so the thought is there's something in there, some potential, right? If I took it apart, I would find that little dot that's the potential. That's almost how we think along these lines, right? But actually, the fact that later on an apple tree rises from one and not a pear tree, based on that, I label potential. That's it. Do you need to find some potential? There isn't DNA, but the DNA is not the potential. The DNA is part of what is the basis of, for me, labeling potential. Yes, certain DNA, but the DNA is not the potential. The apple tree is not the potential. It's all those together. So the basis of designation, let's say, is the DNA. So it's independent on that basis of designation, but not just on the basis of that, also in relation to what is to come. Based on that, I label potential for apple tree. That's it. Is there anything more found? No. Does that make sense? That's it. So potential is just such a nice word when I don't know how to explain it. Potential. I just have a potential, right? But to be more specific, well, very difficult. So I can still say, okay, I use that word potential, but actually it's merely labeled on the basis of what I just said. We have the potential to become Buddhas. It's not our mental consciousness. The fact that we have a mental consciousness and the afflictions are not in the nature, the obstructions that a Buddha doesn't have, they're not in the nature of our mental consciousness. Therefore, I label Buddha nature. Potential to become a Buddha. Can it be found anywhere? No, because the mental consciousness is not the Buddha nature. Well, sometimes it's called Buddha nature, actually, to be honest. That can be called Buddha nature. Okay. But again, if I search for the mental consciousness, if I search for that, they're just moments and parts. It's made of moments and parts that are not that continuum that I actually call Buddha nature, right? So I'm calling that whole potential, but I can divide it up in many, many small moments. Plus, in appearing objects, object appearing to it, object that is perceived, there's an activity. That's not the mental consciousness. But labeled on the activity it performs of perceiving an object, having something appear to it, I label mental consciousness. And on the basis of that becoming in the future a Buddha, I label it Buddha nature. So really, actually, the Buddha nature, Buddha nature, so they say that the mental consciousness is the Buddha nature, actually. So it's not merely labeled on the basis of that. I need to specify that. But the two Buddha natures, the emptiness of the mental consciousness is also said to be Buddha nature. The emptiness of the mental consciousness is also Buddha nature. That's weird, right? Yeah. There's a simple reason for that. Why the mental consciousness is that which becomes a Buddha, so that it makes sense that is called Buddha nature, right? But the fact that the mental consciousness lacks inherent existence allows me to transform the mental consciousness, and it transforms because I focus on the emptiness of the mind or of other phenomena, and it's by focusing on the emptiness and the fact that it's empty that it transforms. So therefore it's also called Buddha nature. Makes sense now? It makes sense, doesn't it? Okay. Wow, we're bringing in so much as part of this Heart Sutra. Hopefully I'm not confusing you. Luca was first. Yeah, Luca, go ahead.
So what is the difference between memory and karmic imprint besides that they're conscious?
Okay, what is the difference between memory and karmic imprint? Okay, so it makes it more complicated. This morning's imprint, that I call imprint because it enabled me to remember my coffee, I wouldn't call that a karmic imprint. Because, well, it depends. I could, they're different, because if I talk of a karmic imprint from the perspective of a karmic result, my memory of this coffee this morning is not the karmic result of the coffee this morning, right? It's not like drinking the coffee or the experience of the coffee this morning, this experiencing tongue consciousness is not the karmic cause of me having this memory today, which is why I wouldn't apply the term karmic imprint. But let's say the following. Usually, a lot of the karmas, for them to ripen, it takes more than one life. I wish more karmas would ripen exactly in this lifetime. Not that many karmas ripen in this one lifetime, which makes it so much harder to believe in karma and reincarnation. No, believing in karma. Because you can be as terrible as it gets and still be so rich and have so much power. We know a lot of people who do terrible things and they're very rich and powerful. Right? One person was mentioned here today. Right? Okay, so doing terrible, and so what is going on? Well, they have accumulated the karma to have this power and all these riches, but unfortunately, due to their tendencies that also come from some previous life, these riches and this power, they become very attached to this, and they want more and more and more, and they can't get enough, and we know what happens. So therefore, a karmic imprint, when the karmic experience is in this life, it's very likely that was created in the past life. Some karmas can be created in this life, can be experienced in this life. The karmic cause was in this life, and the karmic experience was as well, if it's really powerful karma. So the negative one would be to kill your parents. Kill your parents out of the motivation, out of vicious, anger and so forth. You're really angry, let's say with your mother, and you shoot her. Sorry, this is a terrible example, but I'll use it. Because that is such a powerful karma, because our parents, just the fact they gave us life, and they've undergone sacrifices. So if out of mere anger, it's said to be a great negativity. But of course, we need to look at each situation. But let's say you had really, really good parents, and you somehow, in the spur of the moment, you're angry because she tells you to do something and you shoot her, right? That is really powerful negative karma. That could ripen in this lifetime. Or a really powerful positive karma for that matter. I don't know, if you totally give up your life and you save hundreds of people's life, or maybe just one person's life, but totally giving up your life basically, and you happen to survive, maybe that's another example. With your motivation totally pure, just there for others, that would be a powerful, possibly example of. So in that case, the karmic imprint is what is left in that moment. So you've performed this action, and it leaves something behind in your mind, right? Whatever. Again, leaves something behind because it triggers a result in the future. So there must be a connection. So we label karmic imprint on the fact that at the end of this life, we have the positive karma that someone saves our life, for instance, as just a simple example. So therefore, what is the connection between the karmic imprint and then the memory? Okay, so
when something is left behind in my mind, it's not a memory?
No. The memory only arises later on. The memory arises later. So we label on the basis of the fact that you can remember, we label something was left behind. Because otherwise, how could you have a memory? But in that moment itself, when it happens, you leave a karmic imprint that ripens in the form of you later on your life being saved, but you also remember that you saved someone's life. So there is something left behind. We say there's a residue that is labeled on the basis of the fact that there is an experience later on. So on the basis of this experience that corresponds to your actions, having someone else save your life or many people saving your life, that is the karmic result. We label on the basis of that there was a karmic imprint left. And on the basis of the fact that you also remember that event later on, we say a karmic imprint was left. Right? But it's not like the mind, of course, is non-physical. So we look for something left. We look for little dots like imprints, for instance. Right away, we have this vision of or our mind is like a golf ball with all these little holes, right? Of course, that is just a way to help us make or understand it better. But our mind is non-physical. It's an experiencing entity. So we label that on the basis of, we use terminology, imprints. What are imprints? Like footprints in the snow. We use that word because that conveys to us the fact that something is left there. But we say there's something left there, again, based on the fact that there's a correlation between that earlier moment and the later experience. It's merely labeled. So it seems like there's nothing there, nothing inherently there. But on the valid basis of designation, we label. If there's no memory ever, there was no imprint left for the memory. Right? And if the action of saving someone were not volitional, if that hadn't been volitional, it's difficult, but hypothetically, if it wasn't, it wouldn't have left the karmic imprint. It wouldn't be a karmic experience. Therefore, we wouldn't apply that term karmic imprint. Does that make sense? There wouldn't be a valid basis of designation. Yeah? So don't think, we're so used to thinking of inherent karmic imprints. So we think, oh, our mind is so full of these imprints, right? I mean, that's my thought at least. I don't know whether you think along these lines. But if you remember merely labeled, then it's not like we're overflowing with imprints. It's just from the point of view of what could arise from our mind because of our past actions, we label imprints. Luca, does that help, or does it seem we're falling into the extreme of nihilism?
I think in my mind it's still the same, only that when we cross one life to the next, we don't remember.
Our mind changes with maybe that helps a little bit, even without using the word imprint. So one of my teachers once put it this way. Imprints is one way of putting it, but we can also say every time we do something, our mind has changed. And since it has changed, the experiences will be different. That's another way of putting it, without ending up thinking we're totally overflowing with imprints, right? Where do all these imprints, how do they fit into my mind? No, it's probably better to think, and that really helped me to think like my mind has just changed. It's changed, and therefore the experiences it will have in the future will also be different. Right? And so when you die, your mind is different from moment to moment, but this is a huge difference, because in that moment you cannot bring back these memories. Right? The imprint, you see, the imprints are still there because people, because of their meditative abilities, can suddenly remember many, many lifetimes ago things that previously they couldn't remember. It is said that that great practitioners, before they even become enlightened, enlightenment is different. The imprints are gone then. You're just able to realize everything. You don't need an imprint. But before becoming enlightened, there are some people who suddenly remember all their previous lives, and it's an actual memory. So from that point of view, you would actually say the imprints are there, but we can't access them. Our mind at this point doesn't have the ability, but other minds do. I mean, minds that have been developed enough. And again, these imprints are merely labeled on the fact that there's a correlation between a later experience and that later experience, which is the memory, and of course, that which is being remembered. But we're really going into one of the most difficult topics, which is karmic imprints. And again, imprints are a really popular way of saying, I don't know really, what's the correlation? I mean, we say imprint, there's so many different types. There are imprints for tendencies. There are imprints for memory. There are imprints for karmic experiences, right? I mean, tendencies. What are tendencies? That I do something over and over again. For instance, if I haven't been angry for quite a while, but today I just lose it and I start screaming and shouting and kicking and whatever, right? I'm really angry. Then I'm much more likely tomorrow to get angry again and again to get angry. And so this tendency, or if I try to stay away from sugar, and today I eat like 5 pieces of cake. Guess what? Previously I wasn't even thinking of sugar. But then tomorrow, around the same time, I'm like, sugar. Yeah? So it leaves something in our mind, also in our body as well. I mean, in the case of like sugar, for instance, but also the experience. I think it's just that experience of sugar in your mind. Your mind is no longer the same. It's changed because of that. It's a tiny change. It's not like, oh my God, your whole life has changed with those 5 pieces of cake. It's an unusual day, but still, right? So the point is that it leaves something behind, and that we call a tendency. But again, because there's a connection between yesterday and today, a causal connection, I would say in the mind itself, eating the cake is no longer there. We label an imprint that ripens in the form of a tendency. From now on, every afternoon I need my cake. And that remains for some time. Does that make sense? And that's true for cake, that's true for getting angry. That is true for your meditations. You leave imprints, positive imprints, that trigger this reflection in certain moments when it's helpful, right? And there's a really strong sense, they just hurt me. And you go, but it's not there. And right away, deflates the situation, doesn't it? Right? Someone says, you did this, you. And ordinarily we'd be so hurt. And we couldn't think of anything else for the next 5 hours. But just remembering, but I'm convinced that the I that I perceive right now doesn't exist that inherently. It's not there. It's just through that makes all the difference. And in a short time you can let go. And you know what happens? What is one of the signs of Buddhist practice? One of the great improvements, one of the great mental qualities that you develop, very important one, resilience. Psychologists have found that people who practice, this is an experiment I heard about, a Swedish experiment apparently. I think it was Jizuma Denzepamo who talked about it once. So she talked about this experiment or this research. We all have, first of all, a certain level of well-being, a general certain level of well-being. It's a certain state of feeling happy. For some people it's greater. They're in general more happy. And some, that line is lower. So if you were to draw it in the form of lines, there's like a continuous line of feeling satisfied to a certain degree, being happy to a certain degree. Others are maybe less happy, right, in general. And then there are ups and downs, okay? So something happens and that level of well-being is disturbed, but sooner or later you come back. And something wonderful happens and it's like, whoa! But the moment it's happened, it's already coming down. And when you engage in this kind of practice, in this kind of transformative practice, also reflecting on the fact that phenomena don't exist inherently, that this is not in the nature of well-being. So you don't search for some lasting happiness and are constantly frustrated, kind of enjoy it for what it is. They say the level of well-being goes up. There's more contentment. So happiness is really just another word for contentment. So you're no longer looking for satisfaction in dissatisfactory states, which helps you to enjoy it for what it is. And there's more contentment. But moreover, when something bad happens, because of our understanding of impermanence and also that it doesn't exist intrinsically, you bounce back faster. You don't remain in that hole for too long. And even when you go up, it's not like overexcited. Doesn't happen. So this is a funny experience I had when I first encountered Buddhism, but more specifically, my Tibetan classmates. Because I thought they were like rocks. They were like cold. I considered them cold. They were not as excited. I was this yo-yo, right? Wow, something happened. And they were like, and something terrible, like, poor me. I was like, those are stones. No, but they didn't react. They didn't have these strong emotional responses because the whole culture is much more. So we think sometimes they're not very emotional, but it's their whole culture. They're trained from small on. Oh, there's a problem, but okay, it's changing already. The first moment, it's a problem and it's changing already. It's not as solid, although they're not told in those words, but everyone else acts upon it. The whole culture is a Buddhist culture, and so it's kind of suggested to them in other ways. So it's not that big a deal, What's the big deal? It's just a word, for instance, big deal. Someone calls you jerks, whatever. That's just a word, right? And since you hear it from small onwards, it's not such a big deal, right? Be happy with what you have, and so forth. So a lot of Buddhist principles that they're very much familiar with. They couldn't explain them as such, not in the philosophical way, but they live according to them. And so this resilience of like, yeah, it's like, okay, but you don't get sucked into it and feel it's always going to be there and it's inherently there. No, so resilience is really that. You bounce back quicker. But also this overexcitement. The problem with this overexcitement is it leads to attachment. If you're really excited, you want it to last. You hold on to it. Our mind has this glue-like quality. Right? Something great happens. Right? Even something bad. Whoop. I'm a sick person. Whoop. Right? It's got that quality. And that's enhanced by our misperception of reality, our self-grasping and so forth. And if you can weaken that, as I said, that general level of well-being is raised. You become a more happy, a more satisfied person, not so much dependent on so many other things that you can't control anyway. And you become a lot more resilient. Bounce back again quicker, right? Yeah, they're terrible things. They're terrible things, but they come and go. And that's just part of our existence. It's samsara. Let's not make this futile effort of finding happiness, lasting happiness in samsara. That's like finding a clean spot in a garbage dump, right? Finding a pure apartment in a garbage dump. Oh, maybe I'll find the garbage. Maybe I'll find it somewhere. You know, like these garbage dumps, these kilometers of mountains of like, try to find a beautiful, pretty place. You're not going to find it. As long as we have self-centeredness, samsara is really our mind. Samsara are our 5 aggregates. That's samsara. Ketubji, one of Lama Tsongkhapa's disciple, for instance, he defines samsara as the 5 aggregates. And of those, the mental consciousness. That's my samsara. It's not a place, even though it's described sometimes as one. But it's not, because Buddha lives in the same place. And so what is it? Is it a Pure Land and samsara? Is it nirvana? It's the same. No, it's not a place, it's a mental state. Therefore, as long as we have self-centeredness, as long as we have self-grasping, you will not find lasting happiness. I'm sorry, it's just not going to work. It's like if you have a certain cause, you'll have a certain result. There's always a dissatisfactoriness. So what is suffering? It's like not feeling satisfied. And since we're always concerned, we want something for the self that cannot be reached. And in the first place, that self, doesn't even exist the way we hold on to it. We'll never find it. And it's futile, waste of energy. Right? Okay. But the good news is, nirvana is not far away. It's -1 mind. That's it. It's minus that one root misperception, and not more. Really, it's just getting rid of that. But of course, that's hard. It's only difficult because our self-centeredness is kicking and screaming as we're trying to work with it. Yeah. All right, another question? More questions? Yes. Oh, wait. There's another question? Okay, that's...
Yeah, but I don't know, maybe it's...
You want to wait a little?
I can go after also.
You can also ask now.
I just wanted to know if you can add a little on like the mental body, like the subtle sensations of the mental.
The subtle sensations, the mental body. Ooh. You know, please allow me to do this more towards... Oh. That's serious. Oh, that's monkey meets dog, right? Okay. Was it bitten?
No, the dog ran away, so I don't know.
Why don't we ask, is the monkey okay? We always ask, is the dog okay?
Because the monkey is more likely to beat the dog. And the dog was the one screaming, not the monkey. I think that was like painful, like, don't you dare to look at me like that or bite me.
We do have a general attachment towards dog because of the
It's true. In this case, I think, yeah, it's true. But the monkeys, yeah, I mean, sometimes the monkeys is terrible when you see them without limbs and stuff. And I once saw this monkey mother that held its dead monkey baby, and there was only skin left in the head, and it was just caressing it. Of course, for the monkeys as well, but oftentimes they're really naughty. So, no, I also feel that the monkeys, I mean, in certain situation, of course, when they have limbs missing, just that didn't sound like a monkey scream; it sounded like a dog scream. But anyway, going back to your question, so about you talking about actually aspects that are parts of Tantra. So since that usually comes towards the end, shall we wait? Yeah. Okay. But?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I thought you said it. I thought I heard a but. Okay. All right. Who hasn't said anything? I'm getting confused now. Have you said something today? Did you? Did you? Yeah, all of you did actually. Okay. You were first. So go ahead.
So the self-analysis of I,
Mm-hmm.
where we are kind of continuously taking away the exhibition of I,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes leads us to be very indifferent, which can also affect my virtue of empathy, because in the empathy I also have,
Very good.
I feel pain.
You're right. You're right.
Which leads me to the action.
Yes.
So
Yes.
how do I balance it?
Very good. What you're mentioning is our tendency to go into extremes. We're very good at that. Or we're very bad at being balanced. I mean, just going on a diet, for instance, right? Previously, there was one extreme that made us have to go on a diet, and then we go into this extreme of totally not eating, and again, another extreme. So our mind is very much used to extremes. But in this case, the extreme you mentioned, yeah, it's very important that you shouldn't deny too much. You're going to the extreme of the I not being important or the I not being there at all, and you may neglect yourself. That's a problem.
But then if I keep a little bit of that exhibition,
Mm-hmm.
I'm allowing myself to be also angry and guilty and fear.
Yes. So actually you may fool yourself thinking you've negated something, and in actuality you haven't, right? So it leads anger at your own actions. You get angry maybe with yourself, or fear of losing yourself. So in that case, it's like you've negated, but not really. There's a sense you're just disappearing, and that leads to fear. Actually, that's said to be a very normal fear, a good fear also to a certain degree, if it doesn't get excessive. That when you first hear about emptiness, there's no self, it leads to fear. And if you can move on from that fear right away and find a balance between existence and non-existence, then fine. But if it leads to some extreme fear, then it's a problem. Yeah, so it's part of that process that, of course, is just in the beginning, and later on there's no longer fear, but a sense of relief instead. Yeah, but it's very typical. In the beginning, it's difficult. It's very difficult. Like anything we do for the first time, it's hard. I mean, cooking, yoga, it's all difficult. But it gets easier with time. And you need to try and get in touch with your inner Buddha, as they say, your inner wisdom. Right? Get in touch, learn about it. Because initially you need the assistance maybe of a teacher, books, of course the lamas as an example. But as you progress, you'll be able to also find the answers yourself. Gives you a sense of independence, of course, independence in a positive way, that you don't have to always run to someone and ask them, but you can figure out yourself what is the skillful way. But the most important thing is to be relaxed and laid back and never lose joy. We haven't come to the end of the sutra yet, but it finishes with joy. Everyone was happy and went home. No, but they were all happy. The whole congregation was rejoicing and happy. Joy is really important. We have a personal responsibility to be joyful. We have a personal responsibility, and I'm not talking about this overexcitement. I'm talking about a healthy sense of peace and happiness. When I sometimes teach in countries where there's a sense that you should feel guilty if you're happy, because maybe the people around you suffer and therefore you shouldn't be happy.
I was thinking the same, like to be happy or to feel joy, it is still the I which is doing that.
Well, it's still the I, it's the conventional I that experiences happiness, because the other I doesn't exist in the first place. And of course you can't get rid of this self-centeredness, right? You can't get rid of it right away. Let's work with it.
But then if I put the label joy, the joy does not have that much of a meaning itself. Then how can I...
Just enjoy it for what it is. No, but I mean, I think you're describing a tendency of negating too much. Don't negate too much. You exist. Your joy exists, but not inherently. It still exists. It exists. And you experience it. Based on that experience, we label joy. So don't negate too much. When you have the thought there's nothing there, there's no joy, or there's nothing to enjoy the joy, then that's it. Falling into extreme of nihilism. When you feel there's no one to enjoy the joy, then you've denied the existence of the self, and you've fallen to the extreme. So, therefore, you see, the problem becomes when you think then I shouldn't practice because there's no I. Then you fall into extreme of nihilism. That is dangerous. Then it's better to reify. If you don't want to practice any longer, then maybe better to let go of that for a while and wait until your mind is maybe more ready to do this. But the point is joy. Now, don't force yourself. Don't think, oh, it's just because I don't have so much joy, I'm doing something wrong. It shouldn't become a cause for frustration, right? But just give yourself a break. It starts off with, again, we are our worst judges. We're much harsher with ourselves than with others. And that we need to recognize. It's not an advice that you find in the Tibetan text, because the Tibetans are not like that. They're not like that. The Tibetans are very laid back. In fact, they had to introduce a competitiveness in Tibetan schools because they were so laid back. Right? They introduced, I remember when I worked for Emory, when the students come every year and we would have to give them grade. We had to grade them, right? And when we gave them their grades, we had to prepare these tiny little pieces of paper. Say A or A minus. They don't give A pluses at Emory. I found that out, but never mind. So, you have these grades. And then you give them to them and they'll be like. And I remember one day they wrote these incredible papers, really good papers. So we always work in twos. So you work with your TA, with your teaching assistant. So we both agreed really good papers. And the worst grade was a B plus. B plus or A minus, I forget. Maybe it was even A minus, right? Forget. Anyway, so the TA was right next to me, and everyone was with a little piece of paper, big smiles on their face. And then I said, oh, I'm so pleased, because the worst grade was an A minus. The TA goes, oh! Don't you say, oh, you said it. And sure enough, a whole line of people, I only got an A minus. What can I do to get better? Oh my God. The competitiveness. So bad. I mean, they were so unhappy suddenly. They got them, maybe it was a B plus, but whatever. But that was the worst grade. But everyone who was less than an A was depressed for the rest of the day. That was really extreme. The Tibetans are the other extreme, traditionally. Oh, everyone else did so well. I'm so happy. Right? If you're driven by incredible compassion, you want to do good because then you get a better education, you're there for the benefit of others. It's not so much about the grade, but it's about your understanding. That is a healthy kind of ambition. But of course we don't have that naturally. And little kids, they're really not driven by jealousy, envy, and competitiveness, really. It's changing, of course. Tibetans now being exposed to the the modern world or the Western way of competitive. But traditionally they don't have that. And so I remember they introduced this competitive system. Number 1, in front of everyone. No, number 3, clapping a little bit, Number 2, clapping harder. Number 1, whoa, right? Yeah. So just that triggers a little bit to get gifts and so forth. Yeah. The Tibetans still do that to get that healthy sense of, if they can do it, I can do it too. We find that very disturbing because we want to get rid of, we were so competitive already. And the example of these Emory students, that was extreme, but still. Yeah. So, this what the Tibetans have for Dharma practice is helpful. Because that silly competitiveness about grades, how much do they really reflect? I mean, you need to do something, but it's far from perfect, this whole grading system and so forth. It's still very subjective and doesn't reflect who you are. But it's still good because without them, you would work less. Yeah? And so we need to learn to relax. Really. We need to learn to relax. We're uptight and we're really harsh with ourselves. We cannot love others if we don't accept ourselves for who we are. We're okay the way we are. Yeah? And it takes time. And if we accumulate the causes and conditions, we will become better. We will become better in the sense of more compassionate and so forth. So first, love yourself. You don't need to tell the Tibetan that, but we need to tell us in the modern world. Okay? Really need to embrace yourself. Start with the love yourself. I'm good the way I am. I'm okay. Right? I know I can improve, but for now, even my negative aspects, I can use them to my advantage. I can learn from them. The very least, I can learn from my mistakes. Right? I can learn from my weaknesses. It all has advantages. And I can talk until it's dinner time. Unless you do it, oh my God, it is lunchtime. Whoa, please leave. It's almost 12 o'clock. Discussion group, discussion. I'll tell Droka, I'll tell her the topic. Please be here at 10 to 12.
Don't ring the gong. Listen to this video in time, otherwise they get very confused.
Oh, they get confused.
They said we should do it. But
All
just
right.
come, like,
10 to 2 if you can, yes. Great, thank you. And then I'll give you a topic for discussion.